Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jerome Duvall. I am the director of the Institute of European Studies. Would like to welcome you all to this panel on the refugee crisis, a panel that is co-organized by my own Institute of European Studies and my colleagues of the Institute for Slavic, Eastern European and Eurasian Studies and our Center for Middle Eastern Studies. Special thanks to Jeff Pennington for taking this initiative. Before I introduce today's speakers to you, allow me to briefly share some thoughts on the current crisis. One could argue that this crisis does not really need a panel, because the crisis could be summarized in only a few sentences. A house is on fire and people desperately look for shelter. What do you do as a decent human being in such a situation? You provide shelter. However, we all know that there is not just one house in this world that is on fire. Besides the house of Syria, also the houses of Afghanistan, of Iraq, of Yemen, of Somalia, and so many other places in this world are on fire. And then there are so many houses that do not have a roof, that have holes in the wall, where the windows are broken. What do you do with people who leave those houses in search for shelter? Do you also welcome them? And if not, where do you draw the line? And if you do draw a line, do you then send people back who, after a long, dangerous journey, made it into Europe? And if you do send some of these people back, can you then still be considered a decent human being? This crisis does raise complex and uncomfortable questions. Questions such as how is it possible that the first country to open the Iron Curtain, Hungary, has been the first to build a fence to prevent refugees from entering Europe? Questions also about Germany. What to say about German Chancellor Merkel's decision to declare that every Syrian refugee in need is welcome in Germany? Is this a statement that shows courage and deserves applause, or is this unilateral declaration unwise for a leader of a country that is, after all, member of a confederacy of nations called the European Union, a confederacy that can only survive if member states seek consensus and avoid unilateralism? And why do so many refugees have the ambition to go to Germany, to the point that when recently 10 buses were sent from France to an overcrowded refugee center in Germany to pick up people, 4 of those buses were sent back to France empty because refugees simply refused to leave Germany? What does this say about the EU plan to spread refugees all over the EU? Will refugee families really be willing to settle in countries like Bulgaria and Lithuania that have a GDP that is even lower than Syria? Or will they, upon arrival, simply take the first train to Germany? What to think about the intention of the EU to refuse entry to economic refugees and to send them back to their country of origin? Does this mean that soon we will see images of European policemen forcing desperate families with crying children in planes back to Africa? And what about the decision of Denmark, and since yesterday also the Netherlands, to drastically reduce the amount of social support that was traditionally provided to refugee families? Is this a violation of the Geneva Conventions, or is it, as these governments claim, a necessary measure to prevent that Danish and Dutch citizens in need of social aid see refugees as undesired competitors? How worried should we be that an increased number of European citizens will end up seeing refugees as a problem and massively turn to anti-immigration parties? So many questions, so many difficult questions, and yet no other image in this crisis had a deeper impact than the dead little boy Aylan, who, as a modern-day version of Anne Frank, brings us back to the initial statement, a house is on fire and people desperately look for shelter. Let me now introduce our panel. We have with us today Beverly Crawford, a longtime associate director at the Institute of European Studies, who retired in June of this year, but who is still active at our institute as the chair of our Center for German and European Studies. And Bev is still also a professor in international and area studies and political science. She is a specialist in German and European history, and she just returned from a visit to our partner university in Izmir, Turkey. We also have with us Jason Wittenberg, a colleague at the Department of Political Science, known for his groundbreaking study on religious policies in Hungary and a publication entitled Crucibles of Political Loyalty that was published with Cambridge University Press in 2006. Since Hungary has been so much in the spotlight, we're excited to have Jason with us as one of the nation's leading specialists on this part of Europe. And we also have with us a colleague from UC Davis, Keith Watenpaugh. Keith is a historian of the modern Middle East and an associate professor of modern Islam, human rights, and peace. He is the director of the UC Davis Human Rights Initiative and co-director of the UC Human Rights Collaboration. His best-known publication is the monograph Being Modern in the Middle East, a publication that was printed by Princeton University in the year 2006. Each of the speakers will speak to us about 15 minutes, and after those 15 minutes, we'll open the floor for discussion. We will use, however, cards for our discussion, and we have with us two of our student ambassadors, Jade and Jack. If during the presentations you have a question, please raise your hand, and then Jade or Jack will come to you. They will give you a card. Please write down your question on the card. They will collect the questions and bring them to me. So with no further ado, we will start our panel, and our first speaker will be Kate Watenpaugh. Kate, please.
So thank you very much. I thought I could come down to Berkeley to escape the heat of the Central Valley, but that's not happening. I also just wanted to say that I just published a brand new book, this time from the University of California Press, called Bread from Stones, The Middle East and the Making of Modern Humanitarianism, which tells the story of Near East Relief and the League of Nations efforts to try to address the suffering of displaced people from the First World War in very much the same territory. I call it now the topography of inhumanity of of what is today Turkey, Syria, Lebanon in the wake of the First World War. So let me just respond to your beautiful introduction here, which is that it's very important for us to remember, those of us who study the Middle East, and I lived in Syria for much of the 1990s, and before the conflict had gone back every couple of years, is that the house has been burning for a while. And it's very interesting to me that when the issue moves to Europe, we get much better turnouts for our talks. And I'm not criticizing anyone in that statement. I'm very glad that everyone's here, but I mean, Emily can attest to the fact that last year, one of my colleagues and I gave a talk about refugee university students, and I'll address that research in a moment. Here at Berkeley, it also was the night of, I think, Game 2 of the World Series, so it wasn't really a very convenient time for any of us to give talks. We had like 5, 6 people in the audience. It was a quality, not quantity issue. So I think one question we have to ask ourselves is, why now are we concerned about putting out the fires on this burning house? Why now after the images of a young Kurdish boy washed up on a beach in Turkey, whereas we weren't moved by the image of young Syrian children in the outside of Damascus who'd been gassed, or the sort of people living in the vast Zatari refugee camp in northern Jordan, being sold as brides to wealthy Saudis and Gulf Arabs. I mean, that why all of a sudden so much attention? So that's one issue. The other issue is someone who studies humanitarianism, in fact works in humanitarian relief work as well. One of the things that we always worry about is how quickly people's moral conscience is aroused by images like that of the boy on the beach, because that kind of moral interest dissipates very, very quickly. And we're already seeing that first wave of great concern being replaced with anger, resentment, and hatred in the populations of Europe. And I can attest to the fact that the states of the Middle East have gone through a very similar pathway. When these refugee crises are very short, it looks like they could be over in a few weeks. You can be hospitable. But when it looks like these people might be staying for a generation or more, and certainly in the case of Lebanon, they have a long experience with people staying for a very long period of time, it becomes very difficult to have those same feelings of sympathy and empathy. And instead you look to you become much more engaged in other issues revolving around trying to get them to get out. But I think another important point to raise as well is that the UN is right now estimating that most refugees will remain refugees before resettlement for about 18 years. So the house may be burning, and I think it definitely is, but the people who had to leave that house and set up a tent in the front yard are going to be there for at least the life, of 18 years or more. So let me talk about some of my research, which is a way to provide a very unique window on the larger issues surrounding the refugee crisis in what we would call the Arab Middle East, but also in Turkey. So in 2013, I put together a research group with colleagues at the Institute of International Education and their Scholar Rescue Fund, and from UC Davis, and at that point we weren't funded by the Carnegie Corporation, but on our next expeditions we would be, to go to Jordan, where we, with the help of the royal family, were able to enter the Zaatari refugee camp. And the time we were there in April of 23 was a very interesting moment in terms of demography. That was the month when it looked like about 1 million Syrians had fled Syria. And we thought, we'd never seen numbers like that before. 1 million people had fled Syria. We thought, well, surely this will shock the conscience of the world and something will happen at this point. While we were in Jordan, we met with refugee university students, which I think in many ways are a very desirable population of refugees. I mean, many of them spoke English and they were well on their way to white-collar professions. They had gone to school in Syria and were looking for a way to resume their schooling outside of the country. And we interviewed them and talked to them about their goals and aspirations and what they wanted to do. And many simply wanted to go back to Syria as soon as possible. And remember, this is 2013. This is still the violent conflict is still fairly young. Others wanted to continue education in Jordan and then perhaps go to the United States. The women in particular, and we had an opportunity to talk to a large group of women refugee university students in the refugee camp, were most intent on trying to remain in school because it was one way to prevent early marriage, but also to have more control over their futures. And this is one of the things that really struck me at that moment, is how out of control of their own destiny the refugee really is. But while we were in Jordan, we also became very interested in the reception of the refugees by the host population. And in Jordan, I think the Jordanians already were living under some stress. I mean, half the population of Jordan is Palestinian in origin, but we didn't see any outward signs of organized hostility towards the refugees. In other words, they were being broadly tolerated. You'd often hear jokes about, people drive. The joke was a man drives into a town he's never been to before. He rolls down his window and asks the passerby, where am I? And the passerby says, oh, I don't know, I'm from Syria. So, that was funny, come on. I mean, if you can't laugh about refugee crises, what can you laugh about? So Jordan was a very interesting place in that regard, and there was a great deal of hospitality, and certainly Jordan's resources were being stretched, especially in the area of water resources. The subsequent year, we went to Lebanon, which, at the moment, probably 1 in 3 or maybe 1 in 4 of all the human beings in Lebanon right now are Syrian refugees in some form or another. Lebanon, of course, is a very small country who had, shortly after independence, what many in Lebanon consider a disastrous experience of the refugee when they admitted Palestinian refugees who fled the creation of the State of Israel to Lebanon. And in fact, much of Lebanon is a country where there's an entire law code built around preventing refugees from having access to white-collar professions, to owning certain kinds of property, to travel, to documentation, and so on. So Lebanon created really a double-tiered system where it did not assimilate refugees particularly well and made sure that they remained in a second-class position. And this is like a genetic inheritance. Even if you're a Palestinian born in Lebanon, you still don't receive Lebanese citizenship. So we spoke to a great deal. We talked to both refugee university students, but also higher education professionals from some of the very prominent universities in Lebanon, primarily the French ones, like the University of St. Joseph or Saint Joseph. And in these conversations with these educators, who seem to be people very much inclined towards helping educate young people regardless of origin, we would hear statements like, I will not spend a single dollar on a Syrian until you give me $2 to spend on a Lebanese. And the hatred towards the Syrians was palpable. And much of this comes from a historical reality, the fact that Syria occupied Lebanon in a very brutal fashion, and it's not fondly remembered by the most of the Lebanese people. But we did find that Lebanon was a place of great opportunity. Young people worked under the radar. They often held down 10, 12-hour-a-day jobs to pay for tuition, but also to help in the upkeep of their family. And this is one very important thing we learned, which is that often these Syrian young people are among, and their sisters or brothers, are among the sole supporters for an entire network of adults, because it's somehow easier for them to find employment, especially those with some background in business or language. They're able to integrate better with, or able to find work easier. But of course, we also discovered how exploitable they are. As non-Lebanese, they can face what an undocumented worker in the United States might face. Everything from theft of wages to lack of health care. So Lebanon, but Lebanon is a country really teetering on the edge of stability because of the refugee crisis. And even though Hezbollah and the Lebanese army have been pretty effective in preventing the spread of the Islamic State into Lebanon, there is an Islamic State stronghold just on the far side of the border. There have been assassination attempts. So the refugees are bringing with them the problems of Syria. And in fact, that's one of the ideas that we looked at. The title of our work was from Lebanon was "The War Follows Them." Lebanon wasn't really a place of safety or respite. The Syrian secret police was often operating with impunity in Lebanon, kidnapping or executing regime opponents. That next summer, so this had been not this last summer, but the summer before last, my team went to Turkey. Now, of course, Turkey has taken in about as many refugees as Lebanon, but Turkey is a much larger country, so the percentage of population is fairly small. And again, we met with higher education officials and others. And the issue in Turkey is not so much any hostility towards the Syrians. And in fact, there's a certain amount of hospitality, but also the ruling AK party, the Islamist party, to some extent sees the Syrians as a possible adjunct to their ability to control the Kurds. The Syrians would come in if they were given citizenship or some kind of permanent residency. The Syrians would be Arab and conservative and Sunni Muslim, and they would be a great counterpoint to the ruling party's anxiety about Kurds. But in Turkey, of course, the problem is that most of the universities educate in Turkish. And having studied that language for many years, I can tell you it's fairly difficult. But we encountered many young Syrians who had reached college-level proficiency in Turkish in about 3 years. So, where there's a will, there's a way. But all of these countries are facing problems in terms of assimilation. And the fact that those problems have been ignored is one of the reasons why this contemporary refugee emergency has unfolded. That had Europe invested more in refugee relief in the frontline states, or had Europe been much more aggressive in trying to bring about a political or even military solution to the problem in Syria, these refugees wouldn't be washing up literally on their shores. So I'll leave you with that thought as we turn it over to the Europeanists. But thank you for listening, and I certainly look forward to questions.
PowerPoint here. Turn it on. That's just to control your slides. Oh, you control it. Okay, good. Okay.
Use that minute to remind you that if you have questions, please raise your hand. Jack and Jade will give you a card. Write down your question. They will collect the cards for you, and they will pass them on to me.
Okay, so while this warms up, I want to thank Jeroen for his wonderful introduction, and I don't think we're going to deal with all the questions today, but I think we'll start. The title of my talk is "Why Don't Refugees Fly?" Trying to be provocative here, but I'm going to talk about two challenges that the European Union faces in this refugee crisis, and the topic of my talk is mostly about the European Union. So I want to say that just in general, the EU Commission has estimated that it can easily process and resettle 1 million refugees even in a year. But there are tremendous barriers to entry to refugees coming to Europe, set up primarily by the European Union. And we think about 1989, when 16 million people tore down the Berlin Wall to escape the persecution of a repressive state. Over 500,000 refugees have arrived in Greece, Italy, and Hungary this year so far to escape persecution and to escape violence. 2,500 people have died. It's like one in 125. And my argument is that Europe has failed asylum seekers. And I want to ask why this is happening. The Schengen area, which is free travel among particular European countries, excluding Britain, excluding Bulgaria, I think, it abolished the need for passports and other controls to travel around in these countries. If you've been to Europe, then you know what I mean. It's just so easy with the euro and Schengen. But now, as Jeroen has said, I think Europe is building a new Iron Curtain in many ways. And I want to look at how Europe is dealing with the refugee crisis and whether the refugee crisis will actually destroy the EU. Okay, this is our argument that there's two challenges for the EU. One is the challenge of the perilous journey that refugees have to take, and the second one is responding to the scale of the refugees. And I want to make two recommendations in my 15 minutes: that Europe needs to establish humanitarian borders and a policy of humanitarian integration. So the refugees have to take 3 perilous journeys, and Keith talked about 2 of them at least. The first one is persecution and destruction of their homes and families. And I'm mostly talking about Syrian refugees here, since this is the bulk of the refugees, but we have Iraqis and Afghanis as well. The destruction of their homes and families. The second problem is the insufficiencies in the relocation camps. And Keith talked about this, and I'm sure you could talk about it a lot more. But it's incredible that once they leave, they face danger inside these camps. And I'm sure you have lots of anecdotes about this. They're basically a failure. The UN is so far short of the money that it needs to run refugee camps. It needs $8.4 billion, and it doesn't have enough to even provide bare minimum services for the Syrian refugees. So people leave the camps because the camps are dangerous. So they have to take another dangerous journey. They have to come to dangerous camps, and then they take a dangerous journey to leave the camps. And the journey to find asylum is life-threatening. Why is that? We have a refugee convention of 1951 that says anyone who seeks asylum, whoever has signed that refugee convention, if a person comes and say, I seek asylum and I seek refuge, the country has to give it to them if they qualify. And there are large barriers to entry. I don't know why this is doing this, but the journey to find asylum is life-threatening, and there are large barriers to entry to find asylum within the EU. So, okay. Why are the refugees going to Europe? Why are they taking yet another life-threatening journey? Well, life is not safe in the camps, as we see. But I wanted to also add that the countries to which they flee from Syria do not offer asylum. Turkey offers temporary asylum. Turkey is not a signatory to the Refugee Convention. Saudi Arabia gives asylum to no one. United Arab Republics gives asylum to no one. And only 1% of all of these refugees will be resettled in Europe from refugee camps. So if I'm a refugee and I'm looking at this in a rational way, I'm going to say, I'm in a camp, 1% gets asylum, forget it. I'm going to try to take the dangerous journey to Europe. I cannot get refugee status in the country that I'm in. Turkey, I have here 1.9 million. I saw today it's 2.2 million refugees now. And I thought Lebanon was 1.2 million, but it's more. So this is old. I mean, old is like January 2015. So why don't they fly to Europe? I put this picture up, even though it's been mentioned by our first two speakers, because this is what galvanized Europe, this picture of Aylan Kurdi. I went to the beach where he drowned, and there's a giant banner that says "Shame on Humanity" on that banner. I was in Izmir, and you can see I'm looking kind of upset because there's a whole gigantic street in Izmir filled with life jackets and inner tubes for sale. And in Izmir, you can see the refugee crisis unfold as people negotiate openly with smugglers. Being a smuggler is not an illegal thing to be. It's a consensual agreement. I pay you, and you will make sure I can get on a boat. And so here's a child sleeping on his life jacket. People have life jackets everywhere. They used to not have them, but since so many people drowned, there's now a little cottage industry in Izmir making life jackets. 82% of all refugees from Syria actually stay in Turkey. This is from my colleagues at Yashar University. So the majority stay in Turkey. They can't afford to get to Europe. And many of them have started this cottage industry. So the question is, why don't they fly to Europe? Well, is it too expensive? No. Flight from Istanbul to Berlin costs 300 euro. From Cairo to London, 400 euros. It's not that expensive. A smuggler's boat from Turkey to Greece costs 1,000 plus, and the cost is rising as the number of refugees attempt to cross before it gets very cold in Europe. I think already the Mediterranean agencies are getting rough, and they will have to cross in other ways, which they also do. The smugglers don't guarantee any kind of safe passage. They just take your money and put you on a boat and point you to the lights that you can actually see on Kos from the beaches near Bodrum. So why, if it's rational to fly, rational meaning it costs a lot less, you could afford it, refugees could afford, probably, if they can afford a smuggler, they can afford a flight. Why don't refugees fly? And the answer is, and don't fall asleep, I'm going to read this, Council Directive 2001-51 EC of 28 June 2001, supplementing the provisions of Article 26 of the Convention implementing the Schengen Agreement of 14 June 1985. Okay, this is an EU directive that I found, and by the way, this is also inspired by a talk by Hans Rosling of Gapminder. So the first part of this directive basically says that in order to combat illegal immigration, member states can require airlines, if they transport a person who states they're a refugee, which they're allowed to do, and it's subsequently found out that they are not a legitimate refugee, the airline has to pay to send them back to where they came from. So this was a way to get the EU, to get the airlines to do the job of weeding out refugees. However, point 3 on this directive says this doesn't apply to the obligations that member countries have for abiding by the Geneva Convention on Refugees, meaning that there is really no such thing as an illegitimate refugee. If you say you are going, you are legally allowed to go. So really, I just want to go back here. Really, I would think that the European Union is responsible for this dangerous journey. And if you look over time, the EU has curtailed its Mare Nostrum plan to pick up and save refugees who are drowning. They have defunded that and replaced it with Frontex, which is just a border control operation run by Coast Guards. The European Union funds that for member states, and then that's the one way they can try to keep refugees out. The EU is very, very focused on its border control and keeping refugees out. Even Angela Merkel, who said the other day, October 5th, that she was giving over $1 billion to Turkey, most of that money is going to beef up the Turkish Coast Guard and Navy to make sure people don't leave and try to get to Greece, and to build stronger border controls around Turkey, and it's where it's contiguous with Europe's member states. So the EU is focused primarily on border control. I think this is a challenge, and I think it has to be met. That's the first challenge. The second challenge is resettling and integrating refugees in Europe. What you can see in this slide that you should be able to see.
We've lost power.
We lost power. Okay, so I will just say then, that Europe has a lot of experience integrating refugees. In 1933 to 35, Jews started leaving. Started leaving Germany and started resettling in other countries of Europe at first, before the Nazis began to take over. And there was a first precedent to the UNHCR. From 1945 to 1955, there were 12 million refugees entering Germany, mostly in the early years, between 1945 and 1948. From 1956 to 1989, during the Cold War, 3 million refugees came from Eastern Europe into Western Europe. 120,000 Hungarians came in 1956 56. And in the Balkan Wars, 1 million refugees came into Europe. From 2003 to 2011, refugees from Afghanistan and Iraq came to Europe. 4 million refugees came to Europe. Europe has experience granting asylum. There is no question about that. So I believe that the current numbers are manageable based on Europe's experience. In fact, what is described in the media as a flood of refugees, a tidal wave of refugees, is really basically a trickle. There are more refugees living in Istanbul than in all of Europe today, even with the new refugees coming in this year. There are many Turkish cities that have more Syrians than Turkish inhabitants. This is not what the media portrays it as. And EU economies are going to need more immigrants than will be allowed to resettle. So the population of the European Union is decreasing. There are low birth rates, aging populations. Germany is losing 200,000 people per year, not replenishing the population that dies. By 2020, Germany will have lost, since 2015, a million people of working age. So there's a shrinking population of skilled labor. Skilled labor drives growth sectors. We know that. Trained workers sustain health care for older populations. Let's see, one in 5 people in Germany is now 65 by 2020. It's going to be 1 in 4. They sustain social welfare benefits. So the EU economies really need more immigrants than are going to be allowed to resettle. But integrating them is not going to be easy. For example, just take Germany. It's very rich. Angela Merkel has said that we'll take 800,000 refugees over a period of just a few years. But the refugee demographics just aren't what counts when you think about the political economy of the refugee crisis. Protests in Germany is growing. There are scores of attacks on asylum centers in Germany. Integrating refugees, the Syrian refugees that Angela Merkel says that she will take in, is going to depress wages in Germany in the long run. That might be good for Germany, not good for the rest of Europe. We could talk about that if you want. Most importantly, the institutions of the European Union are very weak. And this is the first time that the European Union has taken on a resettlement program in a refugee crisis. Europe has been focused on securing its borders from migrants, not trying to integrate them. And so the EU does not have the institutions that it needs to integrate these refugees. And decisions on integration and how many refugees to take, it rests with the member states, and I think Jason will talk about that. There are countries that are disproportionately affected by the influx of refugees, and they are on Europe's border. So as Europe has had a north-south division with the Euro crisis, it now has an east-west division with the refugee crisis. So the EU is really under siege here, and its institutions can't handle what the EU would like to handle. The EU is really good at taking a crisis and expanding its domain. It has done this all the time throughout its history, and this is what's made the EU strong. So this is the next huge challenge, is integrating the immigrants. So if we want to go forward on this, I would have 2 policy recommendations for the EU. I'm sorry that I can't show you the slide.
It's back on now. The other ones were showing up.
Oh, okay, good. Now I can look and see. These are some numbers that I won't go through, but you know, the numbers change all the time and they're huge. Let me just say that. Let's go to the next one. I don't think we can. somehow. But I want us to say, going forward, I have two policy recommendations for the EU. One is humanitarian border and transit, border management and transit. And there are a number of recommendations for this to grant refugees asylum in the embassies of EU countries, in Turkey, for example, and to start the process, to beef up the process on the border. Angela Merkel has suggested this so that they don't have to leave illegally. And secondly, there's a private initiative called Refugee Air. I wish I could show, there it is. And this is from some Swedish philanthropists who've decided that if refugees can't fly and the ticket agent at the major airlines won't let them fly, then they are going to fly refugees to Sweden. Let them fly is their hashtag, and they want to provide safe routes for refugees they will process applications, look at the applications, make sure that these people are legitimate refugees, and put them on the plane. They won't be official. They'll have to, again, apply officially when they get to Sweden, which is where they're going to fly. They say that the first plane will leave before the first snow falls in Sweden. It should be falling around now, so I'm not sure. I haven't seen that. But, and this will be a cheap way for refugees to come if Refugee Air actually gets off the ground. The second recommendation I would have is for humanitarian integration, in which refugees can be integrated into schools. This is a tremendous job, They are primarily young. Half of the refugees are under 18, and almost half of those are under 11. So they have to be integrated into schools and integrated into jobs. And Europe, my recommendation would be for Europe for European countries, the European Union, provide money for member states to subsidize jobs so that wages are not depressed. And so that, and this is a EU initiative, Science for Refugees, for highly trained refugees who have to wait a long time for their credentials to usually be recognized. The EU will expedite their credentials. So ultimately, what I want to say to you is that Europe needs an influx of migrants, is required to grant asylum, required by their treaty obligations. Asylum seekers have to risk their lives to enter Europe. Safe passage and more border management, not fences, will be required. And that the integration of refugees exposes the weaknesses in EU institutions. The EU can cope administratively and economically, but possibly not politically. And I will then hand it over to Jason, who might talk a little bit about that.
Okay, thank you. Okay. I don't have a presentation, so.
You can turn it on.
So I'd like to talk about the eastern part of Europe. It won't surprise anybody that the East European response has been by and large hostile, if you've been reading the papers. Most hostile in Hungary, which in the region has borne the brunt of the refugee flows. Again, the migrants coming up through Serbia, then Croatia, into Hungary, and then on to Austria. Prime Minister Orban has made it very clear that the refugees are not welcome. A fence was, at first, razor wires, but progressively stronger and stronger fences across more and more borders to keep the migrants out. He's also talked about Hungary's Christian heritage. In addition to that Hungary is Christian, etc. Hungary's not the only one. Prime Minister Fico of Slovakia said that they would accept some refugees, but Christians only. The Czechs, who are among the most atheistic countries in the world, didn't dare talk about their Christian heritage. But they are apparently sending troops to Hungary to protect the common European border. So it's hostile. Now the question is why? You'll hear a lot of reasons. So if you go online or you follow these things, you'll hear a number of reasons. One reason is that these countries, or many of these countries, again, I'm going to speak a bit in generalities here, that these countries in general have no experience of dealing with, with immigrants or with this number of migrants. Now, Bev referenced this in her comments. Let me just say a little bit about the East European aspect of this. This is not exactly true that the countries have no experience with massive influx of migrants. So Poland, after the Second World War, dealt with millions of in-migrating people in the aftermath of the conflict. Hungary, post-World War I, likewise had to deal with an influx of people that were from the Habsburg successor states. Now, it's true that in these cases, these migrants were the co-nationals of the host state. So this is a topic I'll return to later. But still, they do have some experience dealing with it. And also, if we go back deeper in history, Poland and Hungary were actually once multi-ethnic or multinational, rather, countries. And so today they aren't, or aren't so much, but certainly historically they were. And so really this excuse is a kind of a weak excuse. Another thing you'll hear is that it's too expensive, particularly in countries, now we're talking about East European countries, that already contain lots and lots of very needy, native peoples. These countries are not wealthy countries. In general, low per capita incomes, and they're struggling, even before all of this. Now, it's true that there isn't a lot to spare, and so we can maybe appreciate that. However, this could be resolved at the EU level. So, again, Bev made a brief reference to this, how, at the Brussels level, these funds, could be forthcoming, from the richer countries within the EU. So again, it's an excuse, but it isn't clear how seriously we should take that as an excuse. You'll also hear the argument that the refugees are not real refugees. You can put that in scare quotes. That, as Bev very nicely laid out, that they have to pay smugglers. So there's an idea of a refugee, penniless, fleeing conflict. But these people, again, this is the argument that you'll hear, is that the people, first of all, had to have quite a bit of money in order to make it through these refugee, pipelines. And the 1,000 euros is only for the first part. I mean, who knows what they're paying smugglers in Serbia or wherever to get them where they need to go, because no one knows where to go. You have to, and everything costs money. So the argument would be that they're not true refugees in this sense, and also in the sense that there are other places that they could have gone. So, if you look at a map, Hungary, or for that matter, Germany and Sweden are pretty far from Syria. And there are a lot of Arab countries that are in the more immediate neighborhood that don't pose a security risk from the point of view of the East European governments. Egypt. Maybe Lebanon is overloaded. Turkey, obviously we're talking about. Saudi Arabia, zero. They actually are signatories of some of the Geneva Conventions, but for whatever reason, neither the Saudis nor the Gulf countries are willing to accept refugees. Now, that's a separate issue. Maybe Keith can deal with that, but from the point of view of the East European governments, there's this question of, why is this falling into our lap, and what obligations, therefore, do we have towards them? Now, I even think that this is that all three of these excuses that you're going to hear are a bit of a cover-up. They're a bit of a way of avoiding the real issue. They're a way to try and get the problem to go away in a nice way. But what's really going on, in my view, my view of their, what's really going on in their heads, is that East European countries do not want to let in Muslim immigrants. Full stop. They do not want it. They don't like and don't want multiculturalism. The leader that has been most explicit about this is, again, the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who even before this refugee crisis, when nobody was there, was very explicit, has been very explicit multiple times, saying that he does not believe in the liberal solution, the liberal solution of multiculturalism, that Hungary is a Christian country with its own way, its own folkways, and he wants to preserve those folkways. Right? This was echoed in a less explicit way by Prime Minister Fico of Slovakia when he said only Christian immigrants and not Muslim immigrants. The government, the states, they have a fear of the creation of ghettos and a lack of integration. It's one thing to suggest that the EU needs to integrate, but from the point of view of these countries, they see the failures of integration. That might be right or that might be wrong, but in my view, that's what they see. It's the failures of integration. They fear the pressures to change their culture in order to accommodate newcomers who are from countries that have a different religion and culture. They fear potential future violence that they see happening, rightly or wrongly, in countries such as the Netherlands and such as France that already have established Muslim communities. In other words, the Muslim communities in Western Europe. Now, you might argue that they're wrong. We can have that discussion, whether they're right or they're wrong about that, but that doesn't change their perception of what's going on. Now, I think East-West differences in this matter are much greater at the elite level than at the mass level. Where there does, at the mass level, there does seem to be support for limiting or reducing, depends on how you ask the question, the number of accepted people. So at the mass level, and even increasingly at the elite level, but at the mass level, the East-West difference is of degree and not of kind. Now, I'm going to say, I'm going to mention a few opinion polls, a few results, but before I do that, I want to caution about interpreting opinion polls, and I want to make two cautions. The first is in the middle of a crisis, actually three cautions. The first is in the middle of a crisis, people panic and may agree or disagree with things that they wouldn't normally agree or disagree with had they had the time in a calm atmosphere to consider a particular question. So that's the first one. The second caution is that the way you frame questions can have a big effect on the answers that you get. We know this from the research on opinion polling. And in the third caution is that in some cases, and here Germany stands out, people may be wary about expressing extreme xenophobic views. So this is called social desirability bias. A lot of Germans, even those without direct memories of the Second World War, it's like may not be willing to admit to the kinds of feelings they really have. Some opinion polls. One poll that was done in the Czech Republic, and I'm sorry I don't have details on these polls, 94% of Czechs think that the EU should deport refugees. 94%. In a different poll, 87% of Hungarians thought too many refugees were arriving. 55% didn't think Hungary should accept any refugees. So whether you think of that as half empty or half full, I don't know whether that's good news or bad news, but half of Hungarians think that no refugees should be accepted. I also don't think that the people are just following the lead of the elites in this case. So the people are not being manipulated by nefarious. We like to think that it's evil elites, that the populations are, good liberals. I definitely do not think that that's true in Eastern Europe. I think these are genuinely expressed views, and they reflect the fears that rightly or wrongly, those fears are in people's minds. Another poll found 55% of French opposed easing rules for refugee status, even for the ones definitively fleeing Syrian violence. Forget about the people that are, whose status might be more questionable. 44.6% of Swiss want borders temporarily closed. Even in Germany, only 42% of people that the refugees were good for the country in the long term. So, in other words, 58% didn't think, nearly 60% didn't think refugees were good for the country in the long term. And this is Germany, the country where you might expect the most unwillingness to express these sorts of views. Now, the EU, before I come to my conclusion, the EU has made a lot of errors in this, as Bev and Keith pointed out. But there was one that I think was unforced and that actually would, according to the public opinion polls, would have had support of the populations, even in Eastern Europe, which is that the EU failed to separate, in my opinion, the immediate humanitarian needs of the refugees from the long-term dispensation of their refugee status. So, in the same poll in which Hungarians, 87-13, thought too many people were arriving, and half didn't think that Hungary should accept more refugees, a majority of Hungarians in, I believe it was the same poll, thought that the refugees in this immediate sense should be treated more humanely. In other words, not being crowded into the Keleti train, the Keleti train station in Budapest, and should be provided with, food and water and what have you. And so, very interesting opinion poll, because it separated out the two issues. One is, where do they go in the long term, which people are just opposed to a significant number of refugees, from the immediate humanitarian crisis on everybody's hands. I think it is very dangerous. So this does lead to the question of whose obligation is it, which I'm going to leave for the Q&A. But I do want to comment in my closing minute about Bev's recommendation, which I think is dangerous, at least as far as Eastern Europe goes. It is very dangerous for EU elites in the big countries to compel East European countries to accept and try to integrate refugees. And the reason I think this is the radical right is already benefiting all over Europe from its portrayal of refugees as an invasion. Now, you might disagree with this, but they're doing it. And the polls show that Geert Wilders in the Netherlands and the same kind of a party in Germany and the Sweden Democrats in Sweden are making hay of this, and they're getting more popular. Now, I'm not saying that doing this will cause, fascism or neo-fascism, whatever you want to call this, to come to Sweden, the Netherlands, and Germany. I actually don't think it will happen there, but there's a much greater probability it will happen in the eastern half of Europe than it would in the western half of Europe. In Hungary already, a party, much worse than the ruling Fidesz party, is already the second most popular party in the country. In Poland, conservative, guy just won the presidency, and the views that these parties have are popularly held. And if these kinds of parties come to power in Warsaw or in Bratislava or in Budapest, then my view is that we'll all be wishing that some other solution to the crisis had been found. Thank you.
Well, then I would like to thank all three speakers. We have now some time for questions. Feel free during the questions to raise your hand and ask for a card for an additional question. But we will start with a couple of questions on the Middle East and Syria. I would think questions primarily for Keith, but also the other panelists can definitely weigh in. Let me perhaps read a couple of questions. First of all, we started this discussion by mentioning that there was a house on fire in Syria. One of the questions is, how likely is it that the fire, so the actual fighting, will spread eventually to countries like the Lebanon, like Jordan, potentially even Turkey? Second question is, why is there not more pressure within the Arab world on countries like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, to show more solidarity with the Muslim brothers and sisters in need? Third question is, how effective would a safe zone or building a safe zone in Syria be? Then a question about gender. We primarily see, or the majority of refugees coming from the Middle East are male. Could this potentially be that many of these male refugees try to come to Europe because they don't want to fight in the Syrian army? And if more and more men no longer want to fight, could this potentially strengthen ISIS? And then a question about the mindset of the refugees. What do we know about their ideas, about their ideals also? Do you think that those Syrian refugees will integrate easily in, and adapt themselves to the liberal lifestyle in Western Europe, or will there be problems? And final question, ISIS has claimed that it has taken advantage of the crisis to smuggle some of its fighters into Western Europe, who are just waiting for the right moment to start, a wave of terrorist attacks in Germany and France and in Belgium, etc. Is that just rhetoric, or could there be some truth in that threat? Difficult questions.
We have 2 minutes.
Well, the conflict is already spread. I mean, it just depends on how you define spread. I mean, it's spread into Iraq, it's spread into Turkey. If you believe the Turkish government, the Islamic State was responsible for the bombing at Ankara, which, I remain skeptical of, but, that's their explanation. In some extent, this war has spread into Europe, where Europe has become a chief recruiting ground for ISIS fighters. And I'll use that to answer the last question, which is, am I worried about its spread? Well, I mean, ISIS doesn't have to put in these ranks of refugees fighters. They already have sympathizers and people willing to go and fight in Iraq, living in places like Germany and in France and in Great Britain. So I don't think they're using the refugees for that. They already have their assets placed abroad in places like Berlin or places like Marseille. So why don't the rich Arab, I apologize, I'm feeling a little bit ill, so I will go quickly and then maybe exit. But why aren't the Saudis and the Kuwaitis and so on showing more solidarity? Well, I mean, the Saudis are supporting one side of this war against another. The other thing is that the Saudis have a relatively small population, and most of the work in their country is not done by Saudis. That has opened up the door for many Syrians to go to Saudi Arabia to work. So Saudi Arabia has taken in a lot of, I think maybe 250,000 to 500,000 Syrians as workers, but they don't have refugee status, which means they can face refoulement, which is just, return to Syria against their will. But, you'd have to ask the Saudis and the Qataris why they're not showing solidarity. I think They just, that there's a long history there of them not really engaging in humanitarian work or relief. The effects of, I can't read my own writing all of a sudden. What was question 3? I'm sorry.
The safe zone.
Oh,
How
yeah,
effective that would be.
a safe zone would work. All right. Why are we seeing so many men? Well, there's a lot of women mixed in with these groups, so I don't know how accurate that is. But clearly, men fleeing conscription and asking for asylum is within the realm of asylum, but that accounts for a great deal of it. I don't necessarily see a connection with ISIS. The other issue is that most of the real fighting in Syria does not take place with conscripts. It's taking place with sort of the professional army of the Ba'athist state, with Hezbollah, with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, and now with Russians. So, conscript soldiers are, cannon fodder for the regime. They're not really important one way or the other.
All right. Okay. Shall we move on to Europe, or do you briefly want to comment on one of those questions about the Middle East? Perhaps we continue with a focus then on Europe. A couple of questions as well on Europe. Why has there not been more help to countries in the Middle East to welcome refugees there? Because that was one of the comments that Bev made, right? Is there an explanation for that the EU just waited so long and gave relatively little money? A second question is, how far is the current situation a reflection of a failed and perhaps even non-existent EU foreign policy? Third question, could it be that this lack of a strong EU foreign policy also be, an indirect reason for the Russian involvement in the crisis in Syria, and what the consequences of this Russian involvement will be? Then a question regarding the comment that was made that within Europe there have been refugee crises in the past. So why are we, so worried? And then one of the questions specifically asks, aren't the cultural differences among those refugees coming today much bigger than they were in the past? And shouldn't that be, a concern? And then a final question on Europe is, what can Europe learn from the current crisis? And how could, the whole discussion that is taking place now in Europe potentially, be beneficial in the sense that, Europe learns from this crisis, and what could Europe do to tackle similar crises in the future in a better way, perhaps?
Do you want me to start? Why no help for the refugee camps? Well, as we know from having many grants from the European Union, it's a very bureaucratic institution, and the EU has never had, a DG or policy to provide aid to refugees in the camps. The camps are run by the UNHCR, and the United Nations raises money from its members to support these camps, but it doesn't have enough because there are so many refugees in the camps. I think that this would be a good idea for Europe to do this, especially to help educate kids and young men young boys who will be men who are coming into these camps. But it seems to me that this is overwhelming. There are over 60 million refugees in the world, and the UN is taking care of those refugees in the camps when they're in the camps. I actually think it's more of a failed European internal policy rather than foreign policy. Although the fact that the EU doesn't have an army and is not fighting in Syria, one could argue that that is a problem, but it seems to me a cauldron, and maybe Keith would say something about that Russia did come in, and maybe the best thing to do would be to try to form some sort of a coalition with Russia. That was an editorial in the New York, op-ed piece in the New York Times today. Refugee crisis in the past, but now much bigger. They aren't much bigger. I try to make the point that that they're a trickle, that there are more refugees in Istanbul than in Europe. That it is big, but it's big because people are coming in in ways that have not been regulated, and they should be regulated. Those who are not true asylum seekers can be weeded out if Europe would put some money into field stations, and Angela Merkel has suggested that.
Just clarify this. The question of bigger was bigger, that the cultural differences would be bigger.
The cultural
that
differences, I think
people coming
that,
from Muslim countries
yes,
would be a bigger problem than from other European countries.
I think that Jason really discussed that, and it's true not just in the East, but in the West too, in Western Europe. So the primary objection on behalf of the public is that these are Muslims, they're jihadis who are coming in. 59% of Germans do not like Angela Merkel's new policy of the 800,000. That's the same percentage as you mentioned. So this is a huge problem, but and it would take time, I think, to overcome this problem. What can Europe learn? Europe has a tremendous opportunity now to deepen its institutions that can help with this refugee crisis, provide funding for the countries, for the eastern and southern countries that are having to take in these refugees. Europe should suspend the Dublin regulation. That says, and I didn't talk about this, that the first country a refugee enters is the country where they have to apply for asylum. And so that means all the border countries on the Middle East that's where the refugees are flooding into. And Germany has rescinded this so that you can get to Germany directly and apply for asylum within Germany. And I think the Dublin regulations should be rescinded. I wanted to just say something about Jason because I did not mean to say that Europe should have quotas. In fact, I totally agree with you that Europe should not assign quotas to its member states, and it can't do this anyway. It was supposed to be a consensual decision. It was taken by majority vote. That's not the way the EU should do business. There has been opposition to these quotas of, assigning countries numbers of refugees to take in. So this should not be part of it. I think Germany is providing a very good example to say, look, we will take in these refugees and we need them. And the quotas should be done away with.
Thank you, Bev. Jason?
Let me just deal with a couple of the issues. What can Europe learn from the crisis? I'm glad to hear actually that the Dublin was relieved, because that was a big, one of the reasons that Hungary became such an issue was because according to the EU rules, Hungary, if they're coming up through Serbia, which is not an EU member, and coming into Hungary, then Hungary has to register them. And under that agreement, there's a possibility that even if you end up in Germany or Sweden, you could be sent back to the country of registration. And so this actually took some pressure off. Another thing, another lesson Europe can learn is that it needs better control of the European border. More organized, border, in a way, what you were talking about. But I think another lesson of this, is, it brings to light a tension within the EU, which has to do with how much wiggle room member states have to determine their own kinds of policies within the EU. Now, Hungary has been at the forefront of pushing the limits in the last 5 years of how much wiggle room you actually get. And I think this is another example, and I think it's going to have to be something that the EU deals with in the future. How illiberal can you be, while still, remaining within this broad, European family? This is an unresolved question. And related to that question is an even harder question, which is what are the obligations of refugees to their host countries? What kinds of freedoms should they have? To what extent do they have to, Bev talked about integration, but some people talk about assimilation. And so we can't answer them now, but I mean, these are the hard questions. And it has to do with a tolerance for, multiculturalism and how different, these refugees can be from their host countries. Very difficult things to resolve for all of Europe and not just for the eastern half.
Okay. One question still about Europe. So we speak about integration, we speak about assimilation, but we know actually very little about the background of the people coming from Syria to Europe. And there are people from all classes, from all religions, fleeing from Syria to Europe nowadays. And isn't one of the main problems that Europeans simply need to be educated better about who is coming to the European continent now? Do you see any solution there, that there would be, some type of PR development, that we feel that the refugees could be helped if Europeans would know better about their backgrounds, what type of people they are. Maybe Keith could say a few words about that as well.
Well, I think the overwhelming numbers going into Europe are very well educated and middle class. I think that their chances of successful assimilation, or at least integration, are fairly high. The first batches that are coming into the U.S. are going to be overwhelmingly non-Muslim, I think. So they'll have an easier time integrating. Yeah. But these are mostly middle-class, technologically oriented Syrians, and I can't really speak for the Afghans or the Iranians or the Iraqis who are doing it, but the Iraqis tend to be very similar.
Maybe then a question for Jason. Making Eastern Europeans aware of the fact that these are well-educated people, from middle class. Do you think that could potentially, change the mood a little bit in Eastern Europe?
I don't know. Maybe on the margin it would, but it doesn't get to the key issue of multicultural issues. And the probabilities that people think that at a cultural level that the refugees, even if they're well educated, will integrate and accept the East Europeans want the refugees to accept all the folkways of their host societies, even things that the ubiquity of pork, for example, even these kinds of things. I think at this point in time, there's very little tolerance towards, weakening any of these, kinds of this cultural inheritance.
Yep.
I should defer to Keith, but I have been trying to figure this out, who these people are. And the UNHCR does not have very good numbers. It says men from 20 to 69. Mm-hmm. There are 40%, 60% of the refugees are men from 20 to 69. So we don't really know. We know that 7 in 10 refugees coming to Europe are men. And another thing that we know for sure is that these are these mostly are young men who can brave this dangerous journey. And they are young men who, since 2011, have had their lives turned upside down. And I don't think that they are as well educated as we would like them to be. And they don't speak European languages, and so they're going to have to learn. And they can maybe learn fast, and I think they probably can. If anyone can learn Turkish in 3 years, they must be really smart. But I think it's a really big problem, and integrating 1 million kids into schools is just mind-boggling. The EU is going to have to come up with money if it wants to do that, and then that's not going to really take care of the cultural barriers, I think.
Yeah.
Can I just add something, which is, it's often been said that, there are differences between immigrant societies and non-immigrant societies. And I think and not just in Eastern Europe, but also countries in Western Europe, they're just less welcoming, that even if someone does learn the language, as many, of the first wave of Turkish immigration to Germany, even with the kids born there, it took a long time, and who even knows whether they're actually accepted as bona fide Germans, which is not true in the U.S. But it is true in most of the countries of Europe.
Since you mentioned the US, we have also a couple of questions that do question the role of the US in this whole crisis. That we shouldn't see this as a crisis of the Middle East, we shouldn't see it as a European crisis, but as a global crisis. So where is the US in this crisis? What is the US doing to solve the problem in the Middle East? What is the US doing in welcoming refugees here? And should we also see other countries welcoming refugees, countries like Canada, Australia, etc.?
Well, historically, the U.S. has taken about half the refugees that have been listed by the UNHCR. And so the United States decided it wanted to take more of the Syrian refugees. But the U.S. right now is, I think, there was just over the last 2 days a massive tank battle in Syria, where a whole bunch of Soviet-era Syrian tanks were just blown up. And I think this was this great moment for the Syrian resistance, because it's the first time that we see this massive influx of American arms to these groups in the field. So in fact, a true old-fashioned proxy war is beginning to emerge, with one side of that proxy actually on the ground. So it's more like Afghanistan or something. So, or Vietnam. So I think that American involvement there's been no American policy on Syria from the very beginning. And so this I think has caused all sorts of problems. And, but I think finally the U.S. is stepping up in terms of the refugees. And I think that the U.S. is probably going to be accepting Syrian refugees for the next 20 years in some form or another.
Okay. Jason, back to you.
The U.S. takes 70,000 refugees a year. I just read that this morning. But very few of them have been Syrians. But you're right, the U.S. is going to step up with accepting Syrians. So the United States is pretty good at accepting refugees.
Now it's getting late, but maybe we could end with one last question that goes a bit beyond the discussion that we had today. It's a question that relates to refugees, but not refugees as a result of war, but ecological refugees, with numbers that are quite astonishing. In 1950, there were 30 million refugees in the Sahel. Today, 125 million. By 2050, it may be 320 million. So it seems like dealing with refugees is something that will be increasingly, a problem that Western societies will be facing. How would the panel react to that? Beth?
Well, I think what the person who asked the question is talking about is legally classified as migrants, because refugees and asylum seekers are those who are fleeing persecution and the violence of war. And so, and actually, there's a very good article about Syria, and I don't know, Keith, about this, the climate change and the drought, and the drought that has sent people into the cities, that have overcrowded the cities and led to a lot of unrest. So I think, but legally, if you sign a convention, you must accept refugees. You do not have to accept migrants. And most of these people in the Sahel are considered legally as migrants, people, and that's actually when the Europeans talk about illegal refugees, there's no such thing as an illegal refugee, but there are many who are slipping in, and not many, I don't know how many actually, and who are economic migrants and want to find work from especially African countries, and cannot be considered legally as refugees.
Keith? Okay. Well, then I would like to thank our three speakers, Bev, Jason, and Keith, and I would like to thank all of you for coming. Thank you so much for participating.